So nearly a decade ago, there was an MIT graduate student named Nathan Eagle. His job at campus was basically to mine smartphones for big data. And there was a problem he discovered, which is that he had no idea how to actually program the things. So after months of struggling with it, finally he found himself at the media lab one night, where he bumped into a guy he estimated he must have passed in the hallways 50 times. And sure enough, he was the smartphone expert that he needed. At first, Eagle was elated. Finally he'd found the solution to his problem. And then he was crushed. He had wasted months of his life searching for this, only to not have the answer perhaps staring him in the face, but at least passing him by in the hallways. And so Eagle started to take a lesson from this. He basically asked, this was a serendipitous encounter, but can serendipity be planned? Could he have saved himself that time and effort if there'd been some way to break the ice with this other equally shy MIT graduate student? So Eagle did an experiment. He basically took 100 cell phones, the smartphones of the day, and programmed them with Bluetooth apps that basically, when you got into proximity with someone carrying the same phone, it would ping them and would notify them that you were nearby and vice versa. It was basically a digital icebreaker. And so what Eagle did is he took these 100 phones and distributed a gathering about the same size as this one, and basically sort of let them wander around and let them ping each other. And basically the way he describes it is the experiment was a huge success, and the people who enjoyed it the most were people who worked for the same company and had no idea who the other person ever was or had even existed. So basically, two things away from this. One is that basically proximity matters when it comes to sharing good ideas and expertise. An assertion that proved a few years later across the Charles River over at Harvard Medical School, where basically a professor named Isaac Cohane did a study with an army of graduate students tens of thousands of academic papers with hundreds of thousands of authors to find out where everyone was sitting the moment they wrote their papers. And basically what they discovered is that basically the most influential papers were written by authors in very, very close proximity. And so this map you're seeing is basically showing you the most influential buildings at Harvard Medical School. And what Cohane also found is that basically proximity had as much, if not more, to do with the success of those papers, titles of the professor in question or what their nominal organizations are or any of that. Which led to the second point we realized, which is that we do a terrible job still of designing organizations and environments meant to put the right people together in the right place at the right time, even if they don't even know it. We do a terrible job of engineering serendipity. Eagle and his mentor, Sandy Pentland, spent another year actually working on this app and perfecting it. They finally patented it, calling it Serendipity. And of course, today there's an app for that. In fact, there's actually several dozen apps, it seems, with names like Banjo and Highlight and Sonar, and of course, the granddaddy of them all, Foursquare. And what an app like Sonar does is it basically takes your disembodied social networks, Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter, and it maps it onto the Foursquare API. So basically, not only can you sort of find out where your friends are in real time, but also their friends of friends, and their friends of friends of friends. And basically, you end up with sort of ongoing gelatinous social network. And apps like this have been referred to as social discovery or people discovery. And I would prefer to think of it as serendipity as a service. Basically, what these apps propose, right now they're in their primitive state, where you just have the option of sending a person a message if you run across them. But eventually, as these evolve, we're going to take big data and social networks and mobile phones, and you're going to have algorithms in the cloud crunching your data exhaust, so when someone drifts into your proximity, it's going to send you a message telling you that so-and-so is nearby. Here's how you might know them, here's what you might want to discuss with them, and here's what you should say as an icebreaker. For example, when I met my wife 9 years ago, when I crashed a party and had nothing to say to her after a few glasses of wine, except, what is this party for? No, seriously, what is this party for? And unfortunately, I was lucky enough to marry her, and now we have a one-month-old son. But it's exactly that kind of moment of serendipity that can actually change your life. The person who may change your life may be in this room right now, and although you've increased your chances of finding them, there's absolutely no guarantee. That's exactly what serendipity and service is aiming for. But the even more interesting stuff that's going to happen is what's going on the back end. When you aggregate potentially millions and millions of records to basically see how serendipity in cities are working in real time. So what we have right now is this sort of map, which shows all of my Foursquare check-ins over the last few months. It's interesting. You can basically tell that I work at Green Desk a few blocks away and that I spend all my time in Brooklyn. But it's sort of a historical record, and it's a map of places, not people, not where I'm moving through and who I know. What's going to be the next thing, and what Sonar showed me earlier this week, which I can't really tell you about, and I certainly can't show you, is basically where they're building a dashboard that will show you the footsteps of basically thousands of people moving through New York, where they went, how their friends went, that will give us a peek into basically seeing how cities will function. And I'm very excited to this because it's basically sort of the key to the city. It will allow us to see the urban dynamics which have eluded us forever. Cities are the most complicated, most incredible invention that humanity's ever come up with. And it's basically an emergent system that we don't understand, SimCity accepted. And that's why I find it interesting, because the whole point of cities ultimately is serendipity. I mean, if you want to think about cities, we can discuss their infrastructure all day long, we can discuss the buildings, we can discuss the streets, but really cities are agglomerations of people and their social networks. But the whole notion of urbanity is coming from this connection of people between them. And what's interesting about a place like Manhattan, of course, is that we basically engineered serendipity here in the form of the grid. We basically created the short blocks that Jane Jacobs said is what led to great cities. And you can still see this today on the periphery of cities like New York or Chicago or Toronto, where entire villages move from places like Mexico or Afghanistan or Pakistan and basically recreate their villages, stack them in towers, and create these social networks before branching out from there. What's always made cities great is the fact that it sort of scrambles these sort of networks of kinship that we have. The whole notion of the German proverb that city air makes men free. What it's discussing there, I think, is the fact that we can sort of untangle and re-entwine all of these relationships to basically discover the opportunities that will enrich our lives. There's another saying that Jane Jacobs has that cities don't attract the middle class; they invent it, and that's basically what we're seeing. Serendipity, I believe, is the root of this. And this, of course, has sort of been discussed by a number of economists like Ed Glazer and Paul Romer, whose current obsession is building cities from scratch for immigrants in the developing world, who's basically arguing that it's the ability of cities to generate ideas and share them in these sort of dense networks is what makes cities so great. It's what makes them more productive on a per capita basis. It's what makes them wealthier. It's what makes them effectively immortal, which is this graph by Jeffrey West, the physicist at the Santa Fe Institute, the so-called physicist who solved the city. And West goes so far in his data to basically say that cities are unlike any biological creature in the fact that they're immortal and they get better as they get bigger and there's no upward limit. His math is still under review. But what is also interesting is that West also says that every other organization we've ever built is effectively mortal. It dies. Every corporation, every organization, humans are biological, of course, and this sort of seems to be out by what we see all of this. Is 5,000 years old, the longest continually inhabited city on the planet. And large parts of it may be destroyed in the Syrian civil war, but it will reconstitute itself, just as Hiroshima did after we literally wiped it off the map. Cities endure in a way that other things don't. For example, America's mightiest corporations die and then are briefly reanimated as light fare on ABCs on Sunday. So to me the question is, what is serendipity? I'm obviously using it in a sense that's not the traditional meaning of the word, which is sort of a muddied etymology at this point. Serendipity is commonly determined to mean luck, for example, or happy accidents, or an unseen finding. But I would argue that in the context of cities, serendipity is something quite different. It is basically the potential connections in all of our social networks becoming reality at that moment, where basically the links form and fuse. I think of it as potential energy becoming kinetic at that moment, where you meet someone that you had no idea who they were, but if you look back, an order reveals itself. This is always the discussion I have with my wife, for example, who believes that if we had not met that night in that particular occasion, we would have met eventually, that our social networks overlapped enough that it would have revealed itself, the potential would have been there. Another way of thinking of this is, I was listening yesterday to Richard Sennett, who's a sociologist at NYU, who's written a number of books, including The Fall of Public Man, so you can tell he's a bit of a pessimist. And he was basically lamenting that, that cities today are places where people mix, but there are no compounds, in a chemistry. We're mixing solutions together, but nothing is emerging from it. And I actually disputed this notion with him. I argued that serendipity, if we want to think of it in this context, is what happens when those compounds fuse together, when elements fuse. And what makes a city great is a higher rate of reaction than the other cities around it. We can see in places like New York incredibly high rates of reaction where serendipity is happening all the time, where ideas are coming together and we're sharing and spreading knowledge and expertise. And so the question then becomes, I think, for the cities going forward is how do we accelerate the reaction further? Considering the challenges facing us as a species at this point, we can start with climate change and peak oil and go from there. We basically need greater innovation. And despite what most of us may think, innovation is in fact slowing down. If you look into papers about basically the top-notch work of R&D being done, team sizes are going up. productivity is falling. We've plucked the low-hanging fruit with our current organizational schemes, and now we're starting to basically sort of sift through the dregs of it. So how do we do a better job of sort of accelerating this? That to me is the great question of the city. And software is one potential solution. Basically having the cloud do it for us. Another solution, I think, is to basically make organizations more like cities, and then basically we need to think about how we can design cities to accelerate serendipity rather than other potential factors. And so I was thinking all of this, by the way, on Monday when I was at the offices of DEGW. I treat DEGW basically like some people would treat the lobby of the Ace Hotel. It's basically my living room when I'm in the city. Sort of stroll on in and sit down and do some work. The first time I ever went there, in fact, I basically worked there for an hour before anyone noticed I'd even been there. And then I introduced myself to my hosts, the first of which looked at me all sort of googly-eyed because she had just read my book and had no idea that I was coming in there, so this was serendipity for her. And the other host, it turned out, had multiple friends in common and had studied the same sort of subject. And we got to chatting, and she basically said, she was so glad that I'd walked in off the street because she's like, what do I have in common with my coworkers at this point? I should be hanging out with you. I should be discussing these ideas with you, who had really sort of no business being there in the grand scheme of things. Now, the reason I was at DGW was not because I just broke into their offices. I basically signed up there on Loose Cubes, which is a site that's sort of like the Airbnb of office space. Loose Cubes is sort of tied into the whole co-working movement, which we've discussed. But basically, what it allows corporations to do is to basically open up their offices to people coming in off the street, to basically make themselves open to serendipity. And that's what DEGW had done. They basically still run. You can go on Loose Cubes and sign up and roll in there and basically meet the architects who are working there. And the reason that they're so particularly intimately involved in this is not chance. I knew what I was doing when I went there, because DEGW was co-founded by this man, Frank Duffy, whose ghost sort of literally and still figuratively haunts the office. Frank Duffy was one of the first architects in the 1970s to really ask how we use offices and why are we building so many of them. And the conclusion he ultimately reached is that offices are a social, urban, and environmental disaster, that we have basically squandered everything we built in them. I don't know if we have time for a show of hands, but guess the peak utilization rate of most offices. It's basically 30% or less. We built these single-use brittle spaces walled off the street and from people that we barely even use. And so Duffy was arguing that we basically need to make the city more permeable. We need to make it more porous. We need to make it more open to people and serendipity. And part of the reason what he thought had gone wrong is that the original office was designed for basically productivity and efficiency. They were factories pushing paper around, and they demanded synchrony and co-location. Everyone had to be in the same place at the same time, doing the same routing. A situation which, of course, no longer exists. I mean, we basically have software for that. We have Basecamp. We have productivity tools. There's no need to actually design an office that way. And of course, companies started to realize this in the 1930s even when they were figuring this out, where basically, Bell Labs started moving its scientists together to basically, encourage physicists and theoreticians to basically mix ideas, which led to the transistor and the laser and all the other great inventions. But that still had its limits. We pushed up against that, and now we have Facebook, and here's Frank Gehry and Mark Zuckerberg, basically designing the new extension of Facebook as a giant room where, if you ask Facebook, they'll tell you, we want serendipity. We want our workers to collide in their desks in this open space so that good ideas will rub off against each other. The joke there, of course, is that when you look at Facebook's campus, they're basically pinned between highways in the Bay, and despite the fact that they look at their central artery as a main street, it's basically the least urban space you could be. And the new Gehry extension, by the way, you'll have to get there by taking a tunnel under the highway to that open ground of land. So it's not really a city at all. So I think we need to start over. We need to go back and think about how we want to engineer our cities. And what's interesting is that mobile workers existed before there was ever actually an office. This is a coffee house from London in the 1660s. Samuel Pepys, we know from his diaries, was basically a mobile worker before its time. He worked from the docks, he worked from court, he worked in his office next door. He was constantly roaming around taverns and coffee houses taking appointments. The city was his office, essentially, was his workplace. And today, there's a whole discussion that perhaps in the future, everything will be a coffee shop. This is an idea that basically, like wherever you have Wi-Fi, you can access the cloud, and then basically all that's left is to meet with other people. And this is sort of the origins of co-working. Co-working spaces started with a Wi-Fi signal and a coffee pot, and then it was basically about the community you formed around you. But how can we design these spaces to be more porous and more permeable, basically places where people can come in and work alongside us and share these thoughts and share ideas? Maybe a coffee shop is not the right answer. Maybe it's something more like a university campus, like NYU, which is, of course, blends into the streetscape of New York. Or like the new Cornell campus, which is being designed once again to encourage serendipity. They imagine new bridges across the East River, where basically campus mates will sort of walk either Manhattan or over to Long Island City, where they imagine new startups will blend in, and that basically the university and the city will sort of blur together. And the most interesting example, I think, along this lines is happening in downtown Las Vegas right now, where Tony Hsieh, the founder of Zappos, is reinvesting $400 million of his own money to basically build a downtown Vegas from scratch. And the reason he's doing so is not because he wants to help Vegas, although he does, but the reason he's doing so is because he's taken Jeff West's lessons to heart, and he basically believes that the only way Zappos can survive and evolve is if it blurs itself into the city. And so he said that he sees every restaurant and bar in downtown Las Vegas as an extension room of the company's conference rooms when it moves there next year. And then he also sort of sees, that basically they're going to welcome in everyone in Las Vegas off the street into their headquarters to work in a co-working space on the ground floor. Basically try to dissolve as much as possible the barrier between the corporation and the city, because you have no idea where the best idea will come in off the street. And it'll be curious to see what sort of corporate culture you get out of this. It already seems a bit like a collegiate dorm. So I guess in closing, the way we need to think about, I think, design and office design, and basically how we use the landscape, is to look for how we can accelerate how we learn, how we can accelerate the number of connections we make. And so my challenge to you, sort of leaving from here today, is to ask yourself why you work where you do, not in terms of the company, but with the people you work with. Are you still learning from them? Are they still the best skills for you? Is there someone that you could learn more from if you were to work side by side with them? Because we've reached the point where we have the tools to basically work from wherever we need to in many white-collar cases. And we also have the tools to find the people that we need to find. And so I think going forward, we need to basically treat organizations more like the city itself and pursue serendipity to basically meet the challenges that we have to in the 21st century. So thank you very much.